Okay, cool. Hey everyone, we're back again, and we're just picking up where we left off last week. Going to talk about more psych or pop psychology crap and debunking some of these myths that are perpetuated in society. Hope you loved last week, and we thought it was kind of fun, so we're going to keep doing it this week. And Jen, you picked one off of our list that you thought would be a good one to start with.
Um, the one I wanted to do is like, you're an empath. That's why everyone else sucks. And
Oh yeah,
oh yeah, well, yeah, because we were talking about empaths and narcissists, and I feel like those
yeah,
are um overused, wrongly used terms,
yeah.
very misunderstood.
Yeah.
Um, every time somebody acts like a jerk or an asshole, everyone's quickly to say, "Oh, they're a narcissist," and
Hmm.
used so wrongly. But also
Yeah.
the empath, I think people misunderstand. Being an empath, everyone has empathy. Everyone can be an empath, but being an empath, I'm trying to like put this in terms. Sorry, my dog is here. Go away, please. Um,
No, you're supposed to get off of the moon and show the dog. Everyone loves dogs.
I'm in my son's room though, and it's a mess. That's
Oh,
why
yeah. Ooh, gross. Don't do that.
my
Nobody
15
wants to see
room.
that.
His room is a mess. For all you people out there who have 15-year-old boys, you get that.
Yep.
I believe that, there's so much about, empath versus narcissist. There's just more to that. That is such
Yes.
extremes. There's, we're forgetting that there's gray areas in between there, and we're just people who feel, and we often believe that if somebody doesn't believe the same way that we do or think the same way that we do, they're the complete opposite. And we're like, well, fuck that, right?
Yeah.
But
They're a
when it comes
narcissist.
down to it, is that we all have reasons with the way we act according to how we grew up, right?
Yeah.
Were you
Our own
watching
normal.
our own normal, right?
Yeah.
So if you meet somebody who you think is a narcissist, not
Yeah.
necessarily a narcissist personality disorder, but a narcissist,
Hmm.
oftentimes that behavior was actually very functional in the family that they grew up in.
Yeah.
To be able to like sit there and, tune things out, to be very direct, to I always say not to have any softness when they're like delivering
Hmm.
things. Oftentimes that's a survival skill,
Hmm.
and
And I like to see it too as narcissism in a relationship often is a result of a pattern of behavior in the relationship
yes,
where, because most narcissists are in a relationship with a people pleaser, this people pleaser is also somebody that doesn't advocate for themselves. So this person learns just by the predictable behavior where this person doesn't stand up for themselves that I can do this. And it's more mindless than intentional, as with narcissistic personality disorder.
exactly.
They just learn, if you give in all the time, you're also teaching somebody that you will. So there has to be accountability for standing up for yourself, advocating for yourself, setting boundaries in the relationship so that you're not allowing people to continue to learn and have this automatic mindless belief that they can walk on you.
Yes.
So
Well, you think
it's a
about in
process.
relationships, we Pavlov each other, right? We condition each other every
Yep.
single day simply by,
Mindlessly.
yes, we sit there and we, Pavlov, for those of you out there that aren't familiar with Pavlov, Pavlov taught dogs every time he rang a bell, that he'd feed the dog. So the dogs became very conditioned that every time the bell rang, they would expect food. So with that, we Pavlov our partners in so many different ways.
Mhm.
If they have an opinion on something and we don't say anything, oftentimes they think that we're in agreement, right? So
Mhm.
they keep saying and doing the things that they've always said that they're going to keep saying because we, as on the other side, don't stand up for it or don't say anything to negate it. We just allow our partner to keep doing what they
Mhm.
want to do and say.
Yeah.
So Pavlov them, and and they've Pavloved us into silence.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
and when we're going through school, college, and learning about psychology, you have to learn about that conditioning that happens and all the ways that we learn. And if I'm training a rat to push a lever, I don't have control over the rat. I have a relationship with the rat. I only have control over
Right.
my response to the rat. And so you can condition a rat to push the lever every 5 minutes as long as your response is very predictable. The rat can pick up on that pattern And I didn't give the rat the ability to tell time. Its brain, its dopamine system picks up on that pattern, and its brain goes, yep, now's the time, now's the time.
Yeah.
And human beings learn exactly the same way. We are animals and we pick up on these mindless patterns, but our society perpetuates this thinking that everything that everyone is doing is so intentional. And just like we talked about
Yes.
last time about driving a car, very little of what we do is intentional. Most of what we do is very mindless. And if you just follow the psychological components of it, sure, we can say, yeah, you are a narcissist, or you are a people pleaser, or you're weak, or whatever. And without having that whole systems training, like with family therapy, without that, you'll just see it that way. And with that, you start to see that with people, both people are 100% correct in how they look at the problem, because
Yeah.
their experiences wire their brain to respond a certain way. The problem is the pattern that exists between them. And when you change the pattern, that each person contributes some part to, then that pattern changes more quickly because two people are working on the problem, not one. And, so you start to make improvements in relationships rather than somebody that says, I'm empathic. That person overwhelms me. I'm an empath. Well, there's different kinds of empaths too. I say there's a healthy empath and there's an unhealthy empath. A
Yes.
healthy empath is somebody that says, yeah, that person's going through something that's really difficult, and I can feel for them. But an unhealthy empath will say, oh my gosh, I need to fix that for them. So, I use the analogy that, if you're an unhealthy empath, you put your feet in their shoes, but then you wear their shoes home and you go home and you're fucked up all night and can't sleep because of what that person went through, instead of that is still their thing to address. You can be supportive, but you have to hold people accountable for this is your thing. And you have to be able to connect with that part that says, I know you can do this. This is your thing. I'll support you, but it's still your thing. And
Yep.
that's the difference between a healthy and an unhealthy empath. And if I am an unhealthy empath and I say things like, you gaslighted me, you said that you didn't say that, well, in reality, sometimes in relationships, what that person said is not what I heard. Right.
Exactly.
And so there
Mhm.
has to be accountability in the whole system for, if you get into an argument and your partner says, I said that, and you say, no, that's not what you said. I did too. And you just give in. You're also teaching this person in this pattern of
Yeah.
this system that you'll just give in. And pretty soon you feel gaslit and you're calling them a narcissist, but there's no accountability for having given in and not set boundaries where you say, okay, we can agree to disagree, but what's the problem here, right? What is the outcome that we're even arguing about? Right?
Right.
We just stay hurt because we disagreed and you just said you didn't say it, now you're a liar, instead of addressing why was that statement important in the first point, in the beginning. What were we even starting this conversation about?
Right. Well, with the unhealthy, empath too, what happens then too, not only do they overfeel, but they think everything's about them, right? Like
Yeah.
someone did something and all of a sudden they become narcissistic in the sense that they believe that everything is about them, that what they did, what they said, all the things, they had more power and more control over the other person's stuff than they think that they actually do. So
Yeah.
basically, that person's having a bad day and they're like quiet around you. So what happens? You're like, well, I did something, I said something. So now I have to like dance like a monkey to like get their attention and smooth things over when it had nothing to do with you to begin with.
Yeah.
But going
Exactly.
back to that patterns, right? Our brain is, evolved to make sure that we survive. So how do
Yeah.
we survive? By
It's a
predicting
survival state.
what's going to happen next, right? So
Yep.
we do look at those patterns, right? We become very
Yep.
hyper aware of
Yep.
people's body language, their facial expressions, those little teeny tiny micro expressions,
Yep.
the sound of their footsteps, the sound of the way they close a door. So all of a
Yeah.
sudden now that conditioning goes super quick. And if you have come from a family where, you live with a polar bear that was, not sure what kind of polar bear you were going to get each day. Did you have a sleeping polar bear
Mm-hmm.
or an awake polar bear that
Right.
just growled and like raged everywhere?
Yeah.
You learn to now do the same thing with your partners.
Yep.
So not that you're not necessarily an empath. You've just learned to be able to sit there and be hyper aroused enough,
Make a prediction about
make a
how the world
prediction.
works according to
Yeah.
your own
Yeah.
history.
And you're going to
And
connect those dots
yep.
together. Dad was like this, or my mom was like this.
Yes.
So when my spouse or partner gets like this means that they're
Yep.
pissed at me or I did
Yeah.
something wrong. When we're, 99% of the time, we're probably wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have our normal. I know I've said it before. We are all normal within the context of our own lives, but normal isn't always effective because when you take that pattern of this is what worked, this is how my family existed growing up, and now you're the problem. It's not because that person's the problem. It's because they didn't grow up in that environment and they grew up in theirs and they're coming to this relationship with a whole different set of normal. So every relationship, every two people have their own realities. And if you want a good relationship, you have to integrate your realities. There has to be space for two people in the relationship. If you're the loudest person, and you get this person to back down, you are contributing to a problem. But if you always back down and don't set boundaries in the relationship, you are also part of the problem. So it's a
Yeah.
system that is the
Yeah.
problem.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, that
So,
goes back into the other one we want to talk about. Setting boundaries means cutting everyone off, right? So,
right.
being an empath, what happens is we give and give and give and we tolerate. We have a
Yep.
high tolerance for pain and bullshit. We give a lot of free passes.
Yep.
We don't realize that things have expiration dates. So we keep giving until all of a sudden we're like done. So a lot of people will just simply cut people off and think, well, I set a boundary.
Yeah.
And cutting people off is not setting boundaries.
Right.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that is
And,
a response of trauma usually.
mhm,
Growing up in trauma, you've
sure.
learned to go, go, go until you can't go anymore and
Mhm.
tolerate a person or a thing or a situation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think on the opposite side of that, it's been perpetuated in our society that, it's wrong to ever cut off somebody instead of understanding, yeah, sometimes it doesn't matter if you have the same DNA. You shouldn't put up with shit that you wouldn't put up with somebody else, right? That doesn't have matching DNA. There are boundaries that need to be set in terms of how you'll allow somebody to treat you. If you say, okay, I want to integrate our realities and this person is inflexible, the normal thing to do after trying, I always say, don't give up on anything that you don't feel you've given 100% to. Then you get to leave with a clear conscience.
Right.
So, there's lots of things that you can do. Some people don't try with family members because those systems are so ingrained
Yes.
emotionally that a person won't even say, hey mom, would you go to therapy with me? Could we explore our contributions to this problem together? Some people won't even say that because the discomfort that comes from that unpredictability, or um, you know, you think about asking and you decide already what they're going to say. So that's your
Yeah.
prediction. Doesn't mean it's accurate, but even saying something like that can be so unpredictable that that person can't even let it come out of their mouth
Right.
to ask and try something different.
Well, going with conditioning, right? Our parents condition us from a very early
Yeah.
age to know our place, right?
Yeah.
What
Yep.
happens as we get older and all of a sudden we get to the point where we think our parents are fragile, right? Like I can't
Yeah.
say that breaker. My mom is so emotional, or my mom is so this, or my dad is so angry, or whatever your parent is. So we get
Yeah.
to the point where like, well, I can't even say anything because they're going to get upset and they can't handle it.
Hmm. Yeah.
So I tell people, I'm like, your parents as adults, our parents are survivors. They made it this far.
Yeah.
They have taught us how to be in their world. Now it's time for us to teach them to be in our world.
Yeah.
So it's going to have to be doing a lot of things differently and setting
Yep.
boundaries. I always tell people that theory of extinction, when you want to extinct a behavior, you have to
Yeah.
make sure you answer consistently or do the same thing consistently over time and never stray from that. Because the minute that you stray from it, everybody wants you to go back to homeostasis where they knew of you.
Yep.
So
Yep.
that theory of extinction is you got to hold still when you're changing a behavior, you got to stick to your guns and be so consistent.
Yeah.
And you'll easily be able to train your parents, your
Yeah.
older parents, your
Yeah.
children, your spouse, your partner, anyone. It's just by, I often, the term gray rock, right? People gray rocking
Yeah.
it is not giving someone a lot of emotion or expression about something and not feeding into that and being able to say, okay, well, that sounds like that's awful. What are you going
Yeah.
to do about it? So being able to
Yeah.
change the dynamic in
Yeah.
between you and that person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Einstein's definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result.
God, right?
Anytime somebody just feels stuck, even doing the opposite can be doing something. I if I'm working with a family and they're like, this kid, he doesn't come home on time, he doesn't do his chores. And we talk about all the things they've done. We've yelled at him, we've grounded him, we've taken his phone, we've, hit him, whatever. Um, Sometimes the opposite works better. The kid comes home late, and instead of yelling at him, you go up to him and you say, "Oh my God, I was so scared when you didn't get here on time. I was really worried that maybe you crashed." And this kid is going to look at them like, "What the fuck just happened?"
Yep. I
Right?
always tell
Who
people
are
that be
you?
surprised of the other
Yeah.
reaction the minute that you change your own reaction.
Yes, it
Yes.
forces a change in the system. It's a paradoxical response when you
Yeah.
do stuff like that. So sometimes even the opposite is exactly what needs to happen. But we're so, you know, you grow up in a family where your parents beat your ass and yelled at you and grounded you, and now your kid's doing the same thing and you do the same thing, but you didn't raise yourself, you raised another human being, and
Yes.
you have to respond differently to that kid. What works for one kid doesn't work for another. When our kids were growing up, if the boys did something wrong, we're like, okay, give me the cords for your gaming console. Well, if we'd have done that with the girls, they'd have laughed in our faces, like, okay,
You got to
now
know who you're working
yeah,
with
I'm in
too,
trouble.
right?
Yeah. If you don't have an interest in connecting with your kid on their level and using discipline that works for that kid as an individual, you're just responding as if you are the only person in that system, and you will get kickback. Everybody wants to feel valued in the
Yeah.
system.
Well, and you
And
think
they
these
are.
generational patterns run hundreds of years, right?
Yes.
People have, our families have been going off of what their parents did, what their parents did, what their parents did. And
Yeah.
I got to tell you, when I never wanted to have children because I grew up in a family where my dad was just not there. He was too busy off doing his thing, and my mom used a lot of violence and a lot of
Mhm.
yelling and a lot of name calling. And when I got old enough, I'm like, I don't want to have kids. I don't know how to raise kids.
Yeah.
Was like always a kids therapist. I was great with them, but I knew
Hmm.
that having my own kids that would challenge me.
Hmm.
So I waited till I was in my 30s to have kids. And I always said, I'm never going to use violence. I'm never going to call them names. I'm never going to do the things that my parents did to me. So
Hmm.
I always say that, our kids have their own language, right? Like my son, you take away his technology, man, he'll fall apart.
Oh
My
yeah.
daughter, was like, you take away her social, right? So here's a story. So when my son was like 4, we were gonna take him and his friends to the bounce house. At the bounce house, it was the trampoline place,
Oh yeah.
and he was being super obnoxious with around his friends, doing stupid things. And I wasn't gonna get mad, and I just told him, I said, one more time, and you won't bounce. And we're at Target, and he looks at me and he pushes something off the shelf, and I said, okay. and I didn't get
Yeah.
mad. I didn't do anything. We get to the bound or
Yeah, you
the
don't have to.
trampoline place, and I paid for everyone for 2 hours except for him. And I made him sit next to me and watch his friends bounce. And
Yeah.
that boy screamed and cried and was so upset. It hurt me more than it hurt
Oh,
him to listen
yeah.
to him cry. But all I got to do now is say, "Do you think I'm playing?"
Yeah.
The
I had
trampoline
to,
place.
yes, I had to do the same thing with my son. It was, it was like, a high school or a junior high dance, I think is what it was. And he might have been a freshman, I don't know, eighth or ninth grade. And he had all his friends over. They were getting ready to go to the dance. And my son was going through this phase where he's just really cocky and mouthy. And, we were a very playful and mouthy family, but, there was a line. And he was, I don't remember what he was doing, but he got smart with me. And I said, "You want to push it?" And he said, "Yeah." I said, "Okay, all you guys go home." And I made him go home. And he had this girl that he was going to meet at the dance. And he was sobbing. He was so upset. I'm like, now you know. I am going to follow through with what I say. I didn't have to hit him. I didn't have to ground him. I had to follow through with what I said. So he knew where my line
Exactly.
was.
Your
I
bark and your
had to
bite had to
be
match.
Yes, I had to be predictable. And when you create a predictable environment for your kids, they know where the line is. And, you know, I think this is a good segue into talking about spanking. When all human brains are wired to fight or flee aggression,
Hmm.
and all you will ever get from aggression in another human being is fighting, fleeing, or freezing.
Yes.
So if I'm yelling and hitting my kid, I'm not teaching them to understand a problem. I'm teaching them to avoid the problem. Well, guess who they see as the problem?
You.
Me. They will avoid me. So I have to be willing to help them understand the problem the way their brain sees it. And we have an integrated understanding of these two realities. But if I don't accept influence from him, I'm just going to be like, it's my way or the highway. And what you get is you get a adult kids, that have grown up, and they tend to avoid people that taught them to avoid discomfort,
Yeah. Well, and they have
right?
a big sense of shame, right? That they do
Yes.
not think that they're a good person. They don't think that anything they can do is right. We don't have a lot of free thinkers who are going to take
Yeah,
risks.
my parents think I'm an idiot. No, I don't want to hang out with them. They think I was stupid all the time. No, I don't want to hang out with them. They yelled all the time. No, I don't want to hang out with them. So there has to be some integration. I remember, I grew up with spankings for sure when I was a kid. And when my kids were younger, I used that until I learned something more effective. But which is why that intergenerational system is so important. We don't
Yes.
need to my parents did the best they could do with what they knew at the time. I don't hate them. Did I spend a period of time when I was like, they fucked me up? Until I learned that there are other ways to look at it, right?
Yeah.
My way can't always be the highway, or my highway is going right over the edge,
Yep.
right? There are 8 billion other people on the planet. If we don't make space for other people and learn to integrate our realities, you will be alone or
Yeah.
in constant conflict.
Or you're going to feel, even though you may be surrounded by people, you're going to feel alone. You're going to feel very
Absolutely.
lonely.
Yep.
And one of the things too that, I tell people all the time that childhood is your internship to life. And basically, if you go and have a job and you have an internship and every time you do something wrong, someone slaps you or spanks you, well, you're not going to learn very much about the job,
Yeah.
right? You're going to
Yeah.
learn to take up very little space, be very
Yeah.
quiet, or you're going to
Yeah.
learn to fight back super strong, right?
Yeah.
So, like when you're doing that with children, we had the most neural pathways in our brain as children.
A
What
three.
happens? What do they learn about people? What do they learn about authority? What do they learn about themselves? And they
Yeah.
never look at us as parents and think,
Yeah.
what's wrong with us? They end up looking at themselves and taking all responsibility and all blame
Yeah.
and thinking there's something inherently wrong with me.
Yeah. Yeah. If
Yeah.
you're floating in a perfect temperature pool of water and I want to help you learn a simple math problem, here's the math problem: 2 + 4 + 6. You can do that. But if you're floating in a shark tank that I just created for you, do this fucking math. 2 + 4 + 6. Your brain doesn't hear the numbers, let alone be able to put it together because your brain is in a survival state. It needs to get out of the shark tank so that it can learn. We don't learn when we're under threat. We learn to
Yeah.
avoid the threat.
Yes. So all of you out there listening, think about, how you treat your kids. If you were treated like that at work, you'd want to quit. You'd want to run
Yeah,
away. You would not want to stay in this environment. It would be so toxic that
yeah,
you would not be able to we spend more waking hours at work. We would not be a healthy person. And
yeah,
that's how kids are. When we sit there and we use, criticism, judgment, meanness, all
yeah.
those things, that's not very motivating.
Yeah. And
And
if somebody brings their 13-year-old kid into me and says, he never cleans his room. Maybe I mentioned that last time, if he doesn't clean his room, I I say to him, "Has your room ever been clean?" "Yeah." "How does it get clean?" "Well, mom does it." So I could do 12 more sessions with that kid to figure out how to solve a problem he's already solved. He just
yeah,
waits out mom.
he's trained his
So
mom.
yes, I have to go to mom and say, and I've had to ask myself, what am I doing to contribute to this problem? And that's the only thing I have control over. I don't have control over my kid when they're infants. They can still cry after I fed them.
Yeah.
So we don't have control over anybody else. We have control over our response to them. So I will ask a mom, or I've asked myself, what do we do to get you to stop cleaning the room?
Yeah.
Because
Well, and
that he's
if
not
you're
the
if
only
if
problem.
you're an empath, what happens is you don't want to make your kids feel ever the way that you felt, right? You don't want to be
Yeah.
the bad
I
guy.
don't want my kid to avoid me, so I'm going to do everything
Yeah.
for them.
I don't want them to hate me, all those
Yeah.
things. What we're going to create is monsters. We're going to create
Yeah.
children that don't have any sense of
Mm.
ability to go off into the
Absolutely.
world and be good roommates, be good partners.
Yeah, you are teaching your kid that you don't have boundaries, so you will walk on them. I remember as an asshole teenager, I could bug the shit out of my mom, and she would say, "Fine, just get out of my hair." It was awesome every time because I'd be
Yeah.
like out the door on my way.
Yeah, I would do the same things. I knew my mom was hungover and she'd be passed out, and I'd bug her and she'd be like, just fine, go. But then I would feel so guilty. I'm like, God, I'm such an
Yeah,
asshole. But I
yeah,
got my way.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, my guilt was over when I was out partying and drinking with my friends.
Yeah. But
And
you see
why? Because there
manipulation,
were no boundaries.
right?
There was no line. There was no adult expectation for how does the world work? How do you teach
Right.
your kid, to integrate with a reality and accept
Yeah.
some influence from them, right? It can't just be your way all the time, mom, or I will avoid you.
Right.
But
When you think about manipulation, right? Manipulation is often a very functional behavior at some time in someone's life.
mhm.
I
And
worked,
see, I think that's one of the words that I don't like because I think that falls into the same as intent. Like
yes,
somebody
yes.
manipulates instead of understands there is that pattern. You could call it manipulation
What we
without
view as
accountability.
manipulation. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. If I say I'm being manipulated, I'm also ignoring my contribution to what did I teach them they could do.
Yeah. I had a neighbor that adopted a bunch of kids from all over the world. And one of them that she adopted was from, I believe, Africa. And the girl would steal food and she would do the weirdest things. And the mom was like, she is so manipulative. And I'm like, well, I don't think she's manipulative. There's got to be some kind of
There's been
something
a
going on
system that
behind this
worked.
behavior.
Yeah.
Right. So, I would talk to her. She'd come over and I was always the place that the kids would always come and just hang out with me. That's why I always started working with kids because kids always loved me. And she would talk to me and I'd ask her about the food because I'd noticed that she'd go in my pantry and just sneak things and hide it and eat it. And I would always tell her, I'm like, you can grab whatever you want. Just, you don't have to hide it. And she's like, oh, back in the orphanage, I had to hide food. Food was not like something that was available to us. So she's like,
Yeah.
if we got it, we had to hide it and we had to eat it really fast. And so what appeared to be manipulation wasn't manipulation, it was a survival skill.
Yeah, absolutely. And
Yeah.
I think this goes into, our discussion as marriage and family therapists, understanding that systems perspective that, it's not just the way mom sees it, there's other realities there. And the disadvantage of a therapist that doesn't have that systems training may not understand how to help another individual, not just their client, um, not be able to see how that whole system is affected. For instance, even narcissistic personality disorder, like I've seen lots of situations where I have a client come to me after they saw an LPC, a professional counselor, somebody that's trained to work with individuals. And they'll say, this therapist said, he's such a narcissist or she's such a narcissist, and it gets thrown out everywhere. But the problem with a therapist saying that about another person is, one, they haven't met that person to um, diagnose them. They're taking one person's perspective. And even if you're working with a person and you're trying to rule out narcissistic personality disorder, 8 of the 9 criteria that are used to diagnose narcissistic personality disorder are written as relational characteristics. And so if you don't have collateral information, you cannot have an accurate diagnosis for something like that.
Right.
So that when we work with individuals, we also become part of the system, which is why therapists have to have their training to be aware of, when am I becoming part of the system and influencing the system.
Yes.
And so every relationship is a system, a dyad. But absolutely, we all can influence that. We have to have the ability, regardless the size of the system, we have to have the ability to understand there are different realities. And if you don't integrate realities, you don't make space for other people, and people will fight back or they will flee. You will
Right.
get fight, flee, or freeze from that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I think
Well, and
that's
the thing too
important.
is that that system not only is the present, right? That system is also the voices of our past, right? The
The
voices of
wiring,
our
yeah.
parents. Yes, and the actions of the people of our ancestors. So
Yeah.
all those things go forward, right? So you're developed by the way your parents were like parented, by the way they were parented, right?
Yeah.
And like you said, your parents didn't have the tools.
Yeah.
My mom was the youngest of like 5 children, and her father was very mentally ill, very violent.
Yeah.
And her violence was way less than her dad's violence,
Yeah.
but it was still violent. And those
Yeah.
inner theme songs that I grew up with, I mean, I walked away from childhood with the thoughts of, I'm not good enough, I'm not lovable. And I would go into every situation automatically thinking when someone liked me, I'm like, why do you like me? My own mom didn't like me, my brother didn't like me, my dad didn't like me. So
Yeah.
I would sabotage every
You learned
relationship.
that you were unlikable.
Yes, yes. I learned
Yeah.
that I was inherently defective, that I was too much.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and I think that leads into one of the other ones that I saw on the list is, you just have to love yourself. Well, anytime you say something like that, there's an opposing statement to it, which means if you can love yourself, if you have to love yourself, then you can also hate yourself. And
Yes.
neither one has value. And I think learning not to be in this constant place of self assessment is healthier for us, because our self assessment is informed by the wiring that was created from our experiences in our life,
Yes.
instead of, hey, I'm on the planet, you're on the planet. We have equal value. Let's make space for each other. And so
Yes.
I learned to overcome that by stopping attaching meaning to things. This is that,
Yes.
because what means to me doesn't mean the same thing to someone else. So I'm creating problems in the relationship by attaching meaning. If a wife says, every time he rolls over at night, it makes me think he doesn't love me, and I ask him, does it mean you don't love her? He's like, no, I'm tired. And she could choose to believe she's correct and hound him about it. And pretty soon he's going to be like, yo, you're right. I don't love you anymore because I
Yeah.
can't even roll over when I'm tired. Or she could accept that he knows him better than she knows him, and
Yes.
then start having a conversation about, how can I get you to roll over more often? I want to snuggle before you go to sleep. Then they
Yes.
start talking about possibilities instead of impossibilities because of how he's rolled over all those nights that he can't unroll over now,
Yeah.
right? He
Well,
cannot unbrush
we
his teeth.
attach so much meaning to that, right? According to what
Yes.
we've grown up with, right? So it's
Yeah.
so easy to be like, the empath and narcissist, right? If you've learned
Yes.
to read into everything, now you're going to learn to read into your person's rolling over, right? You're going to
Yes.
learn that all of a sudden, if they had a weird look on their face when you said something, it's
Yeah.
because you said something wrong or the way you said it.
Yeah.
You're not looking at their experience and thinking, well, he's
Yeah.
just scared, or,
And
he lost
we
feeling in his arm.
absolutely, we do that when we have parents that yell all the time. We learn to believe
Yes.
everyone's going to yell at me. I'm afraid. We do it when our parents are passive aggressive and they don't say what they need to say. So it becomes our job to figure it out. So we get really good at knowing people, but we actually are knowing them according to how our brain works, not theirs. We do it when our
Exactly.
parent isn't emotionally available. We figure out our own way. So
Yeah.
everything about how those, passive aggressive, aggressive systems work is dysfunctional, which is why everything I do as a therapist is help my clients learn to be assertive. And
Yes.
assertive is honest, direct, kind, and persistent. And the persistence is important so that you don't become aggressive and start yelling about it, and you
Or passive
don't, or
aggressive.
give up yet, or be passive and just give up. I'm not going to say anything, and then I'm going to resent you for what I didn't say. Or passive aggressive, oh yeah, let's just do whatever you want to do, you don't do it
That was
anyways.
about you.
Yeah. So being assertive is honest, direct, kind, and persistent. And if all four of those qualities don't exist in your communication with each other, it's not going to be the most effective way of communicating with each other.
Yep.
If you,
I try to help people find their voice because we're often told that, as a kid, we don't have a voice, we don't have a say, we don't have
yeah,
options. So as adults, I try to like teach the rules of kindergarten, right? To be able to find your voice and all that. Is it kind? Is it necessary? Is it important? All
yeah,
those things, we don't hit, we don't yell, we don't scream, in order,
mhm,
all the basics of communication we learn in kindergarten.
yeah.
We
And
forget this.
just that statement right there, that was three behaviors. But so much about therapy is about meaning and reason and belief instead of understanding all we can see from another person is their behavior, and that includes their
Yes.
words. But from their behavior, we make our own interpretations of their meanings, their reasons, their beliefs, their
Yes.
intentions, and we act according to that. But 100% of that interpretation came from the wiring in our own brains.
Yeah.
And if we can't suspend our own thinking to listen to another person's reality, we're never going to make space for them. The divorce rate is going to increase. The
Yes.
conflict is going to increase.
Well, you think
That
every
communication is
ambiguous
critical.
situation, you put your own thoughts and meaning behind it, and we're wrong the majority of the time.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And the thing with
Yeah.
that too is that, here we are trying to communicate with somebody that believes things their own self. So this is our biggest contender, our brain. It's going to
Yes.
lie to us. It's going
Learning to
to
disagree with yourself.
yeah. And when I'm driving, sometimes I'll overthink. When I get to by myself and the radio's off, I'll overthink. And you'll see me start yelling at myself, like, get out of my head. You're not welcome here. And I do the
Right.
same thing in the front door. I open the front door. I'm like, get out. And I'm sure people are
Nice.
like, who's she talking to? But
That's awesome.
for me, I have
That's
visualized that
awesome.
thinker in my head. It's just this little tiny little fuzzy little nasty thing. And I have to tell it to get out of my brain. I'm like, get the fuck out. You're not welcome here. You're
That's
wrong.
awesome.
You're not correct. You are like fucking up my ability to have relationships. No, you are not welcome.
That's very
Yeah.
cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
It 100% of the time when, and this is one of the other things that's perpetuated, it's all in your head, and it's not pop psychology. It's everywhere. It's all in your head when it comes to mental health. Well, it is from a biological standpoint. Your experiences wire those responses, those thought processes into your head, but it's not because you're fucking crazy. It's
Right.
because your brain made rules before you knew shit about how the world worked. You had influence from, millions of people, and it put wiring in your head that you didn't have a choice about. Your
Yes.
I the story of Lonnie with the sandals. his brain made a rule about shoes instead of a rule about cows. And it's just because that was
Right.
what was important to him when he was 4 or 5 years old. And
Yes.
he wasn't fucking crazy. It was just how he understood the world. So if we don't have respect for the knowledge that that stuff is in there, have the accountability for it, but then you look at how do I change that, right? So you're always designing your life. You're not looking at yourself like I'm just a fucked up mess. You start looking at those things and be like, what is another way to think about this? What is another way to respond to this? What is another way to communicate about this? And all of that has possibilities. We cannot unbrush our teeth. We can't go back and undo any of those experiences. So anything that you're trying to undo, ask yourself if you can unbrush your teeth. Oh,
Hmm.
okay. That's what it feels like to not give that attention. Then we start looking at how do I want to respond to this? So I'll work with a client and they'll be like, I really want to talk to my dad about this. Well, they don't have any emotion that helps them understand what that would feel like other than the emotion they have about it. So
Right.
you can actually create wiring in your brain just by imagining it differently and adding different
Yes.
emotion states to it. So I may say, think about a time that you interacted with your dad and he was fun and playful. What did that feel like in your body? And, when they know what it feels like, then we'll say, try talking to that guy. And they
Yeah.
start to see, oh, he does have that characteristic. And that feels safer to
Yes.
say, hey, I want to address this. And when you help them recognize their own capabilities to remove themselves from situations, you get in trouble by dad when you're 5, you can't get your car keys and go get in the car and be like, I'm not talking to him today. He really pissed me off. As an
Right.
adult, you can. Dad
Yeah.
pisses you off, go ahead, leave. If dad's going to yell at you, you don't need to fight, flee, or freeze.
You can
You
tell
just say,
dad, do not talk to
yep,
me like that. And that
yep,
continues. Leave.
yep. And then
Yes.
you go home and you're predictable. I still love you, but I'm leaving. Do that a few times, and pretty soon that's predictable. And you didn't say, fuck you, I never want to talk to you again. You said, no, I'm not going to allow myself to be talked that way, but I'll
Yeah.
come back and talk to you later. I'll come back 10 times. That's the persistence part, right?
Yes. Well, our hurt
I'll,
inner child stops us from doing that, right? That
yeah,
hurt inner child that was, from that early age, that's only this long, right?
yeah,
That hurt inner child stays with us forever. So when
yeah.
I'm working with people, what I
Until
tell
you
them
change
before,
it.
exactly. So what I tell
Yeah,
people to do before they start imagining that thing, I'm like, that voice in your head, that hurt little child, what does it look like? That fear, that thing, what does it look like?
yeah,
Okay, well, it looks like a pit bull that's like about to attack you. Okay, well,
yeah.
let's make yourself bigger than the pit bull, put a muzzle on it, put the pit bull in the cage. Now, how are you going to deal with that without that little voice telling you that daddy's scary?
Yeah. Did we talk when we were talking about my memory reconsolidation? Did we talk about me sneaking cheese?
Yes.
Yeah, it was just a mindless response.
Right.
And until I interacted with it differently, that was emotional and automatic, just like, you know, speaking to our audience. Imagine taking a bite out of a lemon and feeling that juice in your mouth. And you probably immediately started salivating
Yep, I just did.
because, yep, it's a reflex that happens automatically because you've had an experience with a lemon. Now, you probably had the experience with a lemon when you're 6 months old and your parents are like, give them a lemon. It's so funny to watch their face.
God, we're such
I did it
assholes.
to every I did it to every one of my kids. And but that's why if you don't understand how the brain works, you think I'm just fucked up instead of, well, your mouth salivates to a lemon. Did you fuck yourself up that way too? Or did you have an experience that said, this is the most effective way to respond in this situation? But now you're in a completely different situation. Maybe this person has some mannerisms like dad, and you're going into this reflexive response and not disconnecting that memory so that you can be emotionally present with this memory. So
Yes.
like I've worked with couples where the wife married basically the dad. I loved my dad. He was so awesome. I just want you to be like your dad. And then I'll say, well, if you're having sex, put your dad's face on there. Do you really
Yeah.
want that there? Yeah. And they immediately go, "Ooh, okay. Now I understand that it's not helpful here because this is a separate person." Now go back to his face. Who is he? And what do you know about him and how he wants to be? Because he never wanted to be your dad.
Yes.
He might admire your dad and have some characteristics of your dad, but he still has to be a separate being.
Yes.
And the human brain has about 100 trillion synaptic connections where our experiences are stored. So you have 100 trillion, I have 100 trillion, there's 8 billion people on the planet. The mathematical likelihood that any two can be the same is zero.
Right. Isn't that crazy?
So, yeah, when we
Yes.
start being in relationship with individuals instead of this idea that's perpetuated in society that there's one normal, you start
Yep.
to really be in a relationship with somebody, and it helps you learn to be vulnerable so that this person can care for your vulnerability, not exploit it or shame it or
Yes.
guilt it. And you have deeper connections and healthier relationships and more space for other healthy relationships. But yes, if there's a person that is not, people will say, not willing to change, they might not be ready. You don't ice a cake before it's baked.
Yes.
So
Yes.
sometimes, it's 5 years down the road and that person says, okay, I really miss you. Now I'm ready to do the work. They might have needed to finish baking
Well, and
before
you got
they
to
can
wait for
have
it to
that
cool down
conversation.
too, right? You can't
Yep.
ice it when it's still hot.
Yep,
Yep.
absolutely. So we're
Yeah.
not all in the same place at the same time. So I think it's healthy. Sometimes you say, okay, I'm going to take a break from this relationship for a while. And if that relationship doesn't come back around, that is a possibility. But when you're learning to value yourself, you don't do it because you're the bad person in the situation. You're doing it because you might have needed something else at the time. And I need this right now. You're not doing
Yes.
it against each other. You're doing it for yourselves. It
Yes.
can be healthy to cut off sometimes too.
Yes, I totally agree with you. Yep.
Yeah.
Well, I think we should continue with the pop culture
Yeah.
things next week. I think this is great. I think this helps people understand that not everything is so black and white. There's gray areas in there and there's reasons, not just because we're an empath or a narcissist, but because we are humans and we've all had a
Yeah.
different experience.
Yeah. And when you're listening, feel free to leave comments or send messages. And, if there's a quote that you've heard about, you want us to discuss that, throw that out to us. And
Yes,
we're
please
happy
interact
to
with us.
include it. And, if you don't want your name on it, just put anonymous after it. We won't add your name to it. Ask
Yeah.
questions and we'll um, address it from a systems standpoint, marriage and family
Yes.
standpoint.
Yes.
So we love
Remember,
that you're listening. We
yeah,
see a
thank you
lot.
for listening.
Yeah,
Yeah, be
absolutely. We see a
curious,
lot of good
make sure that
feedback.
you're doing things to change the generational things that have happened along the
Yeah,
way. And you have the power to do that
yeah,
simply by
and
doing things differently, taking risks, being curious.
yeah,
Just,
and you are
yeah,
not fucked up. You are normal within the context of your own lives. Let's
yes.
just move towards being more effective.
And
So,
breaking all those bad habits that you've learned throughout your
yep,
life.
yep,
Yeah.
they're mindless. They're not because you're fucked up.
Yes,
So, yeah.
exactly.
All right. We'll see you guys next time. Like,
Thanks, guys.
share, subscribe, talk about it, communicate differently with each other from this systems lens. See you
Thanks,
next
everyone.
time. Thanks.